Hi guys, and welcome to Module 3. We'll be going over, for the first chapter in Module 3, forest ecosystems. So we're going to be talking about forests, forest management, some issues with deforestation and some of the consequences, as well as ways to remediate those issues. So for the beginning, we're just going to talk about a little bit of an introduction into what forests are and why they're useful to us, as well as what kind of biodiversity they provide. Now, before we get into too much, it might be useful to provide a sort of definition to what forests are. I know most of us know or have an idea of what a forest is, but sometimes a concrete definition can be really useful. So, very loosely and broadly defined, a forest is defined as any ecosystem with a very high concentration of trees. Now, there are multiple types of forests, and they're usually determined by what types of dominant tree species are present in that forest, the soil structure of that forest. Remember, we talked about soil structure in a few of the earlier chapters, and then what kind of climate, basically the type of precipitation, the amount of precipitation that area receives, as well as the annual temperature regimes of that area. Now, forests cover a large amount of the space on the planet. About 30% of Earth's land surface area are dominated or covered by forest ecosystems, and you can see that a little bit on the world map below us. Any area in green or red is a place where there is a forest ecosystem. Now, we're going to also talk about layers of a forest, and this is very important because different layers of a forest typically have different animals, different types of ecosystems or sub-ecosystems, even within the broader context of a forest ecosystem itself. The uppermost or the outer layer of a forest, working our way from the top down, is something called the canopy, and hopefully this is a word that you guys have been familiar with or have heard in some context before. The canopy is usually formed by crowns of tall trees. Normally this is the outermost layer, again, usually formed by the outermost or the longest branches reaching skyward from some of the tallest trees in the area. And this is sort of the crown of the forest. Moving our way downward, we have something called the subcanopy. And this is sort of like the mid layer of the forest. This is sort of the foliage or the lower branches occurring underneath the main canopy, the outer layer of the forest. And it normally has things like different sorts of birds, different insects, tree climbing organisms, things if you're in a tropical ecosystem, something like maybe monkeys, squirrels, anything that sort of likes the branches and some of the protection that the subcanopy can provide that the outer layer, the canopy, can't really do. Remember, the canopy is the outer layer and it's very exposed, so if there's any sort of predatory birds or raptors, the canopy isn't a really great layer for organisms to reside simply because they're easy pickings for anything that wants to eat them. The subcanopy usually offers a little bit more protection, and so you normally see a little bit more biodiversity in that area. Now, moving our way downward, even lower, we have something called the understory, and that is a layer of the vegetation just below the canopy, or the subcanopy. Now, normally, while the subcanopy and the canopy have branching structures, that's where all of the trees begin to move out with their branches. The understory is normally dominated by either trunks of tall trees or some of the shrubs and bushes that are emerging from the ground layer. Now, again, this is an area that has a little bit more biodiversity, again, because it's relying on some of the protection of the canopy and the subcanopy. Again, once you move your way downward in the forest, you have a little bit more protection from predation. Now, finally, we have the forest floor, and this is dominated by the shrub layer, basically the bushes, different sorts of ground-dwelling plant cover, as well as detritus and that O-horizon that we talked about in earlier chapters. So this is going to have a lot of detritivores, this is going to have a lot of different fungi that can break down some of the leaf litter that is being shed from the upper layers of the forest, as well as ground-dwelling organisms that can't really climb trees. You might have some large herbivores, for example, that can eat some of the shrubs and can't maybe climb any of the trees, so any hoofed mammals like deer, several different types of large ground-dwelling predators, if there are any in that ecosystem, and different sorts of bugs that like to crawl around on the forest floor. So again, it's useful to note that there are different types of forests, and these are going to be largely determined, again, by the dominant tree species that are in that ecosystem, the soil structure of that ecosystem, and then, of course, the climate, the dominant precipitation and temperature regimes that that area sees. Now, we're not going to go into too much detail about this because these were largely actually covered in the biome section of Chapter 4. The first type of forest that we're really going to talk about here is the boreal forest. Remember, that's in the very high latitudes, very northern and very southern latitudes of the planet. They're going to be dominated by evergreen trees that can withstand some of those colder temperatures, things like spruce trees, fir trees, pine trees, and of course hemlocks. And these actually contain the majority of the world's trees. These are very dense, very large forests. And we see them in places like Russia, Scandinavia, and Canada in the northern latitudes, and then in Patagonia over in South America in some of the southern latitudes of the planet. Next, we're going to talk about temperate forests. And this is sort of a catch-all term for deciduous forests that we see in the eastern United States, the temperate rainforests that we see in the western northern United States in places like Oregon, and then tropical dry forests that we see in places like India. Now, these are going to have oak trees, beech trees, maple, elm, and walnut trees. They're going to be seen in the mid-latitudes of the globe, in between the equator and the polar latitudes, and then they're going to be in areas such as the United States, maybe in Europe, and maybe the southern portions of Africa and South America. And then finally, we're going to be talking about our tropical rainforests. So tropical rainforests are the highly biologically productive ecosystems, forest ecosystems that are found in around the equator. They're going to be dominated by teak, rosewood, mahogany, very biologically productive tree species. Are going to have a lot of different organisms in there, very highly biologically diverse, and of course we're going to see them right around the equator, places like Central America, South America, and then like Central Africa. Getting into a little bit of the ecology of forests, forests are extremely complex ecosystems, and this has a lot to do with something called structural complexity. Structural complexity is essentially the large number of interconnecting parts or structures in a given ecosystem. In forests, these are going to be things like the branches and the outer leaves in the canopy and the subcanopy of a forest, some of the trunks and maybe some of the shrubs in the lower layers, and then on the forest floor or beneath the forest, the roots that are interconnected. And when you think about structural complexity, think of persisting hard structures. Again, those are going to be interconnecting pieces of wood, and think about how all of the different spaces and nooks and crannies in these different areas can facilitate things like habitat for different organisms, places for things to hide, places for things to make a home out of, as well as a high number of resources. Forests tend to have a lot of nutrient cycling. There's a lot of organisms that can readily break down exposed nutrients as forests shed things like leaves or bark. There's typically a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus for different organisms to thrive in, and for very high and very complex food webs to form as a result. Structural complexity tends to, in and of itself, create very consistent environments. Remember when we talked about those ecosystem engineers in Chapter 8, those organisms that can facilitate very constant, consistent conditions for other organisms to then specialize and thrive in. Some of the buffering capacity of the ecosystem engineers of different trees in a forest are things like wind flow. Think of how when wind goes into a forest, it kind of slows down. There are a lot of different branches and leaves and trunks to keep that wind from picking up speed. So it tends to be very constant wind conditions, very constant temperature. Forests, as they evapotranspirate, as they release water into the air as a result of photosynthesis and respiration, typically provide a lot of rainfall. They actually facilitate their own climates. So forest ecosystems see a lot of higher layers of precipitation compared to adjacent areas in similar climates that don't have forests, as well as their own different types of temperatures. So these very constant conditions create a realm for high biological diversity and very high net primary productivity. And kind of going off of the incredible complexity of forest ecosystems, as well as the biological productivity and diversity of forest ecosystems, it should be no surprise that they provide a very wide range of different ecosystem services. First and foremost, as a direct result of trees being ecosystem engineers, forests tend to provide very good habitat for a variety of different organisms. And they do this simply because they influence the climate from buffering things like wind, providing consistent precipitation, as well as controlling temperature. They influence their own climates, as well as they provide shelter via all the structural complexity, all those nooks and crannies within the branches, trunks, and roots of different trees. So they provide a lot of shelter for different organisms. Second, forests provide or do a very good job of promoting healthy soil structures. Second, forests do a really good job of facilitating healthy soil, and they do this through the root structures of different trees. By simply being present on top of the soil and using their roots to hold down the soil, the trees and different forests prevent soil erosion. Basically, by trapping and holding soil in its place, wind and water can't sweep the upper layers, the O and A horizons of soils away, and it provides a stabilizing mechanism to keep all of the nutrients in the upper layers of the soil in their place. And as a result, by simply trapping those O and A layers in their place, soils in forest ecosystems have the opportunity to become very mature and very well formed depending on the climate that the forest is in. Third, forests tend to produce clean air. Like any other plant, organism, or any other autotroph or primary producer, trees photosynthesize. They take in carbon dioxide, and via a reaction with sunlight, they provide oxygen, which we all like to breathe. So they absorb carbon dioxide and they produce oxygen. Now, we don't actually think of them as doing this, but forests and trees actually do a really good job of providing fresh water. By slowing the movement of water through a forest, it allows water to permeate into the soil instead of flowing on top of the soil. And as a result, water flows through the soil and actually recharges aquifers. And as they do this, the water actually purifies as it gets filtered through all the different grains, as well as through root uptake. And so we get very clean water that is recharged through the aquifers as a direct result of the water flowing through different forests. Forests also promote a lot of nutrient cycling. Remember how we talked about all of those detritivores and those decomposers on the forest floor? And they're readily available to recycle any nutrients that are shed through the canopy and the subcanopies of the forest. So any tree leaves or any tree bark that is shed gets readily broken down and available to other organisms. In addition to this, forests do a lot to actually trap and store carbon in roots and biomass. Remember that trees photosynthesize, and as they do that, they incorporate the carbon they take out of the air into their own biomass. As the forests or as the trees grow and mature, they sort of shed that, and instead of releasing that carbon back into the air, they trap it in the ground below us. Finally, forests do a lot of good from a cultural services perspective. They are very aesthetically beautiful to walk through, and so a lot of people get a lot of spiritual value from walking through a forest ecosystem. A lot of people use forests for recreation. I don't know about you, but I love doing trail running or trail biking through any of the different forest ecosystems in our area, as well as a little bit of adventure. It's fun to go exploring once in a while. And then in addition to all of the different regulating and supporting services that we just talked about, forests also provide a lot of different resources, so a lot of provisional services that we sort of take for granted. The most obvious example are lumber or wood for shelter, for building homes, for construction, and then a lot of textiles. So, for example, cork, the cork that comes in your wine bottles actually comes from cork bark, from cork trees in the Mediterranean. There are a lot of different medicines that come from the plants or the trees in forest ecosystems. There are a lot of food. For example, apple trees produce apples. There are a lot of fruit-bearing trees that we take advantage of. And then, of course, fuel. Charcoal or wood can be burned and readily used for fuel to heat our homes or to power different basic commodities. So it's really useful to keep in mind that there are a lot of different ecosystem services that forests provide that we really take advantage of. And this is really something that we should keep in mind when we move into the deforestation section, which we're going to be talking a little bit about next. That's everything we have for this lecture. I look forward to seeing you for the next one when we go into deforestation.